She had just awoken when she heard a knock at the door. Her eyebrows knitted together. This was the first time anyone had come to her house so early. As she shuffled over to see who was waiting for her, she was surprised to find an officer. An arrest warrant was flashed in her face, alleging she hadn't paid her trash bill. Having no idea who he was dealing with, he escorted her to his cruiser. Getting arrested that day was the last thing Loretta Reed expected to happen to her. Living in her retirement home in Tucson, Arizona, she led a quiet life. Despite her advanced age, she enjoyed everything her modest neighborhood and friendly neighbors had to offer. However, everything today would come to a screeching halt. Loretta had finally found a home after a long and eventful life. While wading through calm and rough waters, she ensured the future of her children and grandchildren. The sunset years were all she had left to enjoy now that everything was done and dusted. That was until the officer showed up. Loretta and her husband, Roy, had lived in Fort Lauderdale before moving to Tucson. During Roy's military service, she had been a high school teacher. They had 5 beautiful children together, 2 of whom sadly passed away. Roy also succumbed to cancer after fighting it for 3 decades. Loretta had learned a few things from him during their time together that could save her life in the event of an emergency. The teachings of Roy had never really resonated with Loretta. Their activities together were enjoyable to her because she got to share his interests with him. However, she never imagined she'd have to use the skills he taught her. It had been some 2 decades since he had passed away, and she had been afraid of having to apply everything he taught her. After all, he wasn't around to watch over her anymore. As time passed, this worry dwindled. Until now, that is. As was Loretta's custom, she had gotten up at 5 a.m. to get ready for some errands in the city the day the incident occurred. She lived alone with her 3 cats she adored to the moon and back, as all her children were grown and had already left home. Unaware she was about to end up in handcuffs, she thought she would visit some friends in town and head to the farmer's market later. It was a knock that shook the house while she was enjoying her breakfast of pancakes and scrambled eggs. 8:15 a.m., read her wall clock, which made her look out the window and stop everything she was doing. With its radiant light, the sun illuminated the driveway just as it rose. Although Loretta tried gazing out her window, she wasn't able to see who was knocking. There was another knock, louder than the last. Loretta shouted back, "I heard you!" Walking across the kitchen to the front door, she said, "I'm on my way." In her 82 years, she had never heard anyone knock so aggressively on the door and wondered why anyone would feel the need to disturb her quiet morning. When she entered her living room, the first thing she noticed was the dark cruiser parked outside. In consideration of the possibility that one of her neighbors might be in trouble, she knitted her brows. The community was well behaved, so that didn't make sense. Generally, gross misconduct did not occur. Loretta should have known the cruiser was waiting for her. The officer stood waiting for her as she gazed through the peephole. Her door was unlocked when he knocked again, and she opened it and welcomed him in. She wondered why a law enforcement officer would show up at her door so early in the morning. Was he here to report some bad news? Had something happened to one of her kids, grandkids, relatives, or friends? Her heart rate picked up, thumping in her ears as the air thinned. She leaned her body on one side of the door, taking a deep breath to clear the thoughts away. But the reason for the officer's visit would be a very different one. "Is everything okay, officer?" Loretta asked, as soon as she could manage the words. The officer nodded, producing 3 documents he'd been holding. "Are you Loretta Reed?" he asked, his tone flat. "I am," Loretta answered quickly. "What seems to be the problem?" The officer presented one of the documents and said, "Mrs. Reed, we have a warrant for you." "A warrant?" a surprised Loretta asked, inching closer to the officer to get a better look at the document. "Warrant of arrest," the sheet of paper read. Was this some sick prank? Loretta had never heard of someone her age getting arrested. "It's for not paying your trash bill," the officer clarified, and Loretta almost fell back. "What?" she asked, skimming through the warrant. "So, are you going to handcuff and take me to the station?" "Yes, ma'am," answered the officer, with a curt nod. "I have to." From the corner of her eye, Loretta could spy another officer getting out of the parked cruiser. "Isn't there a way to handle this without all these extremities?" Loretta asked. The officer beside her was unshackling the cuffs on his belt, getting ready to bind her. "I wish there were, ma'am," he answered, still emotionless. "You are about to arrest an 82-year-old woman because of a $77 trash bill?" Loretta asked, and the officer looked away. Loretta laughed, looking outside the house. "This has to be a prank," she whispered. One of her grandchildren usually got a kick out of pranking people, but Loretta couldn't see her. But as she continued laughing, convinced the officer was joking, she noticed he wasn't budging. He didn't mirror her laugh or even smile. He only tapped the cuffs against his hip, as if to tell her he wanted to get all this over with. "You're not kidding," Loretta said in realization, fear flooding her veins. The officer was serious. He was at her door because of the unpaid $77 in trash bills. He wasn't going to leave empty-handed and would make sure she was in the back seat of his cruiser as he drove back to the station. "Sir," Loretta said, "the bill was already cleared. I know it was because I confirmed it last week." The officer sighed. "We wouldn't be here if it was, ma'am." "We're going to have to cuff you," he continued, insisting it was standard procedure. He asked Loretta to turn around with her hands behind her back, and when she did, he asked her to face the front again. He cuffed her, the cold steel chilling her skin as he did. Loretta looked around, hoping one of her neighbors was seeing this. She needed someone to come and help, but she was all alone. "Can't you just take me without these?" she asked the officer. The cuffs were already weighing her arms down like weights. They were scratching her skin, the pain building with every passing second. Her eyes ran wet without her knowing, and she closed them, bringing her arms up to wipe the tears. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a bad dream. But why were the officers arresting her when she was positive she'd cleared her bill? Well, over the last decade, one of her daughters had been handling her utility bills. Since Loretta was advanced in years, her kids had taken over the technical end of her life, ensuring her bills and whatnot were always settled on time. So what happened this time? Whether her daughter cleared the bill or not didn't matter to Loretta. No matter if the bill went unpaid, all the county had to do was take away her trash can and suspend her pickup. There was no need for all this violence, especially considering her age, and that all this was because of a $77 trash bill. Her eyes welled with more tears. Could she convince the officers not to serve the warrant before it was too late? "Isn't there any other way we could handle this?" Loretta asked as she wiped her tears again. "No, ma'am," the officer answered. His voice brimmed with irritation. "How would you feel if your grandma was arrested?" asked Loretta. Her fear and pain were slowly turning into anger. "Do you think any of this is right?" The officer didn't answer. With the help of the other officer, they bundled Loretta into the cruiser's back like some common criminal, not caring that she was in pain and uncomfortable. They didn't engage her in any conversation on their way to the station, even though she kept asking them to hear her out. It wouldn't be long until she had her revenge. On reaching the station, they threw her into a cell. Her tears flowed anew as she looked around. She hadn't been in such a place in close to 60 decades. The only time this had happened was because she'd been protesting for civil rights in the late 50s and early 60s. "Y'all put me in this cage?" a teary Loretta said. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." Loretta spent a day in the cell until one of her sons got her out. But they discovered that the county needed them to pay a $275 fine. They also found out that Loretta's daughter had filed for the bill to be cleared months in advance, but the request was still pending due to a complication at the bank. Would the county hear her case out now? The police chief was the first to release a statement informing Loretta that she'd been given several warnings about her unpaid trash bill. Apparently, an officer had been passing by her house every noon for a week, trying to talk to her. They claimed they also left a door hanger to inform her of the officer's visit. She was also summoned to court over the unpaid bill, and when she failed to show up, she got arrested. Loretta's eyes went wide as she read the statement. She always spent her afternoons at home and had not had any officer or municipal worker knock on her door over her trash bill. Additionally, she didn't see any door hanger informing her of their visits and didn't get any letter or notification that she needed to appear in court. Her son cleared the $275 needed for her court fees, but Loretta went home ready for war. In all the years she'd spent with her husband Roy, she'd learned several life-altering lessons. Among the most significant was to never go down without swinging. From the moment the officers showed up at her door, she knew something odd was happening behind the scene. There had been rumors about the county outsourcing its garbage disposal to a private company. Those in the know maintained that there was an operation to extort money from the elderly and disabled members of the community. The best way to do this was to arrest them over small utility bills and have them pay large sums in court. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Several residents in more struggling parts of the county were arrested for unpaid trash bills. Most of these individuals face financial difficulties, but were charged criminally and forced to pay substantial court fees alongside the bills. Sick of what was happening, Loretta decided she would bring this entire operation crashing down.